Hi, I'm Amanda Lenhardt from the Deep Research Consortium, and one of these research themes is understanding what drives extreme poverty. And as part of this, DEEP is bringing together current data and evidence to understand how climate change, in particular, is expected to affect efforts to reduce poverty. So, in this interview, I'm talking to Joanna Upton. She's a senior research associate at Cornell University, and she's going to talk to us today about the impacts of climate hazards in Madagascar's Grand Sud in particular, based on some of her research there. So thank you for joining us, Joanna. I'll jump into a few questions to get us started. So it's quite commonly said that people living in extreme poverty are most affected by climate change. But what do we really know about the experience of people living in extreme poverty? And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit from your experience in working in Madagascar.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as we all know, climate change is super multifaceted, and it's a big global phenomena. And even in Madagascar and in the Ground Sud, where I primarily work, people are aware of that bigger phenomena, and they're kind of aware of these changes that are happening sort of slowly over time, or the greater volatility. But the way that I think it's easiest to see why it's different for the poor is to think about very specific examples, right? And to think about how that plays out for people there. Like, one of those that's huge in the great south of Madagascar is as pertains to water and rainfall, right? And one thing we know about climate change is that it's not just that some areas are getting really suffocated in terms of getting less and less rainfall or having more common droughts, but a bigger or broader issue is just the general timing and quantity of rainfall being skewed, and not knowing when it's going to come. So it's both the kind of predictability as well as the quantity, right? And that's happening the world over. But like, if you think about farmers, say in the US or in developed country settings, wealthy settings, they have so many different strategies for how to handle the frequency or the timing of rainfall coming at a different time. For example, they can irrigate, so they're not even that tied to the frequency or the timing of rainfall. Then they can also transition toward, there's all this research and development on new crop varieties that are more resistant to changes in rainfall. If everything else fails, they can change crops entirely because they have robust markets that can just sort of absorb a totally different crop choice, or they have crop insurance, right? So then turn the same thing to farmers in the great south of Madagascar, and the same basic problem. For one, basically crop insurance is out. The idea that you could, there are some new seed varieties kind of coming about that might potentially help people, but the ability to afford those is really scarce, right? So when they're looking at the timing of their rainfall, being unpredictable or less predictable than it used to be, they're choosing to plant the scarce seeds they have, and it's kind of like playing the lottery. Like, they don't know, if now is the right time. They want to get them in sooner to have enough time to harvest, but then if they go too soon and there's a little bit of a dry spell after they plant, they could lose everything, right? And so then they go about, they make a choice. Well, then it's the wrong choice. Then they're out of land or they're out of seeds. Even if they can solve those problems, the roads are horrible. So they might even like know that, oh shoot, now's the time to plant. It's my third chance, and I can just turn my fields over. I even do have some money I set aside for seeds in case this happened. And now, oh, the road that I used to get to the market is totally flooded out, so I can't go get the seeds, right? So it's basically a lot of these big picture options, like changing crops. They can't do that because there are no markets to absorb different crops. They're having to produce what they can eat, right, and what the market will absorb. But then all of these other options are then not available to them, right? So the result is just basically greater malnutrition and disease, and then things like the other components of climate change, like more severe storms, they're left more vulnerable to those as well.
And is Madagascar particularly vulnerable to these environmental shocks?
It is, yeah, exactly. It's kind of a, I mean, it's been highlighted by different, news outlets as kind of a poster child for this in many ways, because it has a very diverse agroecology, so it sort of depends on where you are. But the Great South in particular is both cyclone prone, which leaves it, very much open to the storm side, and and that region, for example, has experienced five of the most severe cyclones, I think, in the past 30 years have been in the last 3 years. So it's really a concentration of these severe storms coming through. But it's also just the aridness, the fact that it is rain fed agriculture, there's no irrigation. So that leaves people obviously much more vulnerable. And that the soil and the system are not very easy to diversify within, right? There's a limited range of crops that they can sort of bear, and then through the entire island, the infrastructure is so poor. So when it comes to the ability to adapt, to say change what you produce in response to markets, or come up with other options, just poor infrastructures for water and for transportation limit those options as well.
I know Madagascar has one of the highest poverty rates in the world. How do people cope, based on the research that you've been doing recently, and having been there recently? How do you see people kind of adjusting, having so few options available?
One of my main takeaways on that is not very positive, which is to say that people end up having to spend, being forced to basically spend more of their resources, I guess, to kind of proverbially dealing with the symptoms rather than the disease, or kind of putting out fires. Often, literally, it was bushfire season when I was there, so people are having to spend time literally putting out fires, but also dealing with, say, the damages from the last storm. And they're just forced to do that rather than to be able to actually foresee and look at the next storm to try to set up systems that are, more robust for the future. So I would say, by and large, what you see people doing is kind of that, as they say, ex post and sometimes negative coping strategies of having to sell off their livestock in order to, meet food needs, trying to do other economic activities or other sort of, suboptimal things. There is a lot of talk there of migration and of people out migrating to urban areas and so on to make ends meet. In the Great South in particular, that's a very mixed bag because the infrastructure is poor and the options are limited, even, within the range that people can travel. So we don't see as much of that kind of productive seasonal migration of people able to leave when they're not busy on their farms, earn some money, and come back. There isn't as much of that in that region, but around Madagascar, there is increasing kind of migration, whether it's permanent or seasonal.
Hearing that description and thinking back to this question about how climate change and poverty interact, that a situation such as Madagascar's sounds more like a humanitarian situation, and that as opposed to conflict or sort of political unrest, the humanitarian crisis is persistent climate
Right.
events. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, and indeed, like the area where I'm working is a perpetual or common recipient of both emergency assistance and broader development aid. There's a lot of incentive to try to push toward more development thinking, but in reality, humanitarian aid is still quite necessary. In certain areas, the emergency aid cycle is still, very important in people's lives, basically kind of backstopping acute food needs and disease, because that's the other side of this climate problem. These storms bring with them not only malnutrition, but very high rates of disease from the weaknesses linked to malnutrition, as well as just a whole range of other problems that the island faces: malaria and high loads of parasitic infection and everything else.
What about particular groups that might be disproportionately impacted by some of these climate impacts? So some of our research has suggested that women might be disproportionately affected.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll go back to that water example because this is a perfect one where you can really kind of viscerally get why this would be a problem for certain people over others. So one is in the South, I was talking about water as a problem for agriculture and, of course, your harvest failing. But down there, as in many other places in Africa, it's not even just for agriculture that water is a problem. It even goes down to water for all other needs: sanitation, food preparation, and even drinking water, right? And it's not very hard to imagine why hygiene and sanitation issues would be worse for women, right? Women are often either menstruating or primarily taking care of babies, breastfeeding, and hence the water needs are just, and sanitation needs are much more acute. But also, so we have a thread of work looking at the link between the water insecurity and water challenges and food security in the South. And the focus is often, say, on this agricultural pathway, but we're looking at that and analyzing the degree to which the other pathway of when you're thirsty and you just literally don't have enough water for your own sanitation and for drinking, other economic activities that you might do to complement your food security when agriculture is failing are difficult. Often things that people don't love in Madagascar, like charcoal gathering and firewood sales and stuff. This is labor intensive, but they also involve going to markets. Well, the roads are horrible, as I'd mentioned, but also it's exhausting. And if you're thirsty, traveling to a market is hard. And also, say for a woman, if it's that time of the month, who wants to be going and interacting with people, right? Especially when you don't have enough water to take care of yourself. So we're seeing that like the actual water and food connection there probably for most households passes more through the limitation that it puts on these other economic activities, which would both affect women more because of fundamental gender differences, but also because those are the activities that women are more likely to be able to control in that setting. They don't own the land. They can't make decisions about large livestock. Whereas things like going to the market to sell chickens and eggs, that's something they can do. And that's something where climate change has a still greater impact through this, water and sanitation pathway. So that's an acute example, but I think there are many, that you could think of. Particularly, I would think in Madagascar, it's actually the gender difference is huge.
So obviously, people living in poverty are probably some of the least responsible for the climate changes that they're themselves experiencing. So just from your perspective, from your work within Madagascar or in any other context, thinking about where responsibility lies, and ultimately not so much talking about blame, but where are actions to resolve this? Where can they come from?
Yeah, that's a great point. Where I see the biggest gap here, and it's hard if you travel there much, it's hard not to come back to this, is the big infrastructures. Individuals and communities can't build their roads. They can't afford to put in water points. They can't handle that kind of stuff. And I think there's a massive international but also government failure in that regard in many of these challenged areas, and Madagascar is a huge one for it. People need roads and they need fundamental water infrastructures, and those are essential in this case to as what you see there is again more like fixing the damage to a road maybe after a cyclone, but not fundamentally transforming the infrastructure to make people more adaptable in the future and more able to seize different opportunities, say when there's certain crops are failing, to shift to others because they have market access where they can sell those, and infinite types of opportunities that relate to connectivity, the ability to get around, as well as for different types of assistance to get in. Because if you can't, get there, it makes it very hard to do these things. So that's one lens where I think that there's just more that needs to be done. Another side of it that I find somewhat frustrating in working there as a person who's really focused on nutrition and poverty and the vulnerable in Madagascar is that so much of the aid that comes in is really focused on the biodiversity and the forests and the animals. It's an incredible place. And that biodiversity is essential for future generations in Madagascar. I care about that very deeply. But often the problem with these initiatives that take the preservation of the forest as the first point of departure and the people second is that they might identify like a way that people's poverty is bad for that forest. Like people are coming to the forest to do this thing that's harmful to the forest. So they go to the communities and then find a way to solve that problem, as in find a way to have the communities have some other alternative source of that thing, so they leave the forest alone, right? But I think, and that those can be really neat projects. I don't have anything against them per se, but if you start with the community and then think of its overall needs and then think about how the forest fits into that, right, and take that as the point of departure for how you're going to help those communities, it also would absolutely support the ecology side. But I think that if you're going the other way, you're often missing the more holistic picture of what people need, right? They're just doing these things. And I see so many of those projects. And I think that, like I said, no judgment against them. I think a lot of them are doing good work. But the point of departure is backwards. You need to kind of start with poverty, start with the people, because it's their place and they have a long history of engagement with the agroecology of the place, of course. And it is in their own best interest to have that last for the future, and I think that that's not, you're not having to teach people that the forest is useful. It's not like, people don't get that, but there's so many reasons why that's not their first priority anymore, that they have to feed their children now.
You have a country that is, gets international attention, if nothing else, with regards to its biodiversity, preserving its forests. But it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't get nearly as much discussion about its extremely high poverty rates. It's in the highest in the world. So another area
Totally.
where, Madagascar stands out, I think, is lack of evidence on poverty. So my next question is maybe a big one, which is, we're finding that we don't know perhaps as much about the relationship between climate change and poverty as we might think. What would you say we need to be focusing on as researchers or anyone commissioning research to, for evidence with regards to poverty in Madagascar?
Yeah, that's a great question. We should keep an open mind because one can go in and say right now, this is what we don't know and need to work on. But we should keep an open mind because literally, what happens next year might even change that priority, or might give us new information that says, "Oh shoot, that was another thing that we didn't even have on our radar that we should start to look at." That said, like, I mean, I think one of the unknowns that comes to me that I think we need to work on more, and it's not just Madagascar, but it's highly relevant here, is that we all know, in talking about climate change in particular, but it's true in other areas, but it comes to kind of the fore in climate change, is that policymakers and especially governments think in very short time scales, right? That's like kind of election cycles. And whereas climate change and reality and humanity and poverty think in like intergenerational, time scales. And bridging that gap is really hard. And there's a lot that we don't know about how we can bridge that gap. Like, to what degree, I guess in the West, we're trying to see bit by bit if, like, governments can or cannot be, say, rewarded for making decisions that people won't see the benefits from for a generation. But if people start to care about that, then maybe you bridge that gap that way by getting governments to care because people care, and you're elected based on your willingness to do things for climate change. That's a nice idea, right? But in a more concrete way, in looking at a developing country, you have, like, the people making decisions about funding about a certain community having one time scale and set of priorities in mind, and that community having a different time scale and set of priorities in mind. And I think there's a lot we don't know about how to bridge that gap, and to what degree communities having more information or working better together could help to change the priorities up the spectrum into their own governments and government actors, as well as other people making decisions about how money is spent in those places, and where to allocate resources.
I think we've,
Um, yeah, I'd
it's
agree.
become very clear through the discussion, the relationship between climate change and poverty, and how, Madagascar is, a really exemplifies those two things, both in an incredibly challenging way, but also, a space for kind of innovation and such. So thank you, Joanna. This has been an incredibly
Yeah,
insightful conversation.
come up
I
with some
think there's a lot
opportunities.
to
Yeah,
learn from this. So thank you again for taking the time to speak with us.